And in this section, we're going to look at absolute value. And we're going to look at inequalities involving absolute value. I will define what absolute value is, of course. I'm actually going to give two different ways of defining it. One's a lot easier than the other. We're also going to look at equations that involve absolute value. And not only that, we're also going to look at inequalities involving absolute value. So those are the things we're going to look at. Okay? So absolute value of a number, equations with absolute value, and inequalities involving absolute value. So I'm going to define now absolute value. Okay. Now, for any number, okay, for any number out there, B, so B is just representing a number. By definition, the absolute value of B, which we denote by this, okay, it's by definition, it's defined, this way. So this is the absolute value of B denoted by this thing here. You know, you put B there and you put two vertical bars between them. You get the number itself back if the number is non-negative. You get the number itself back if the number is non-negative. Otherwise, you get negative the number if the number is negative. So if the number that you put in, the absolute value, if it's non-negative, if the number is non-negative, you get the number itself back. If the number is negative, you get negative that number. So for instance, if you look at the absolute value of 1, right? Well, 1, the absolute value of 1, is just going to be 1. Now, why is that? Well, 1 is non-negative. 1 is non-negative, right? So as here, you're going to get back the number itself if the number is non-negative. That's what's happening. For negative 1, the absolute value of negative 1, that's going to be negative it, which is the double negative, so you get positive. So the absolute value of negative 1 is negative negative 1, which of course is just 1 since negative 1 is negative. Right? Because again, negative 1 is negative, right? So you're going to get negative the number back. Okay, that probably is confusing, which I understand. So another way to look at absolute value is distance. The absolute value of a number is the distance between that number and 0 on the number line. So it's the distance between the number and 0 on the number line. So that's what absolute value also is. Okay? So for instance, here you can see the absolute value of a number B is how far B is from 0. Same thing with the absolute value of minus B. That's how far it is away from 0 along the number line. So for instance, the absolute value of 3, well, what's that equal to? Well, if we look at 3 over here, right? This is 1 unit, this another unit, a third unit. So 3, the absolute value of 3, that is 3 units away from 0. So it's 3. So the absolute value of 3 is 3. What about 1? Same idea, right? The absolute value of 1, well, that's 1 unit away from 0, so it's 1. So that's what we got here. Now, what about the absolute value of negative 2? Well, let's take a look. Negative 2, right? We're at 0. Negative 2 is 2 units away from 0. 2 units away from 0. the absolute value of -2. That's 2 units from 0. So the absolute value of -2 is 2. You're just going to the left instead of right. Now, notice something really interesting. The absolute value of 1 and the absolute value of -1 are the same, right? And that would make sense because the absolute value of 1 is 1. That's 1 unit away from 0. The absolute value of -1, though, of -1, it's also 1 unit from 0. It's just in the other direction. Okay. The absolute value of 3 we saw is 3, right? But the absolute value of -3 is also 3, because -3 is 3 units away from 0. It's just to the left instead of right. It's in the negative, it's just to the left of 0 instead of to the right of 0. And that brings us to, it's good to keep that in mind because now we're going to look at this, equations involving absolute value. Okay, now, the absolute value, so let's say we want to solve this equation. Okay, now we're looking for the solutions, meaning we're looking for the numbers you can plug in for x that make this equation true. In other words, we want x so that the absolute value of that number x is 2. Well, think of it in terms of distance. This is asking for all numbers x whose distance from 0 is 2, because that's what absolute value is, right? We're looking for all numbers x whose absolute value, that is, whose distance from 0 is 2. Okay, well, what numbers do that? Well, if we're at 0, we go to the right. We go 1 unit, another unit, and we're at 2, right? This is 2 units away from 0, so we're at 2. So 2 is a solution. But what about the other direction? Here, we go 1 unit to the left, another unit to the left. Now we're 2 units away. We're at -2. So the other solution is -2. So there's 2 solutions to this equation, 2 and -2. And it's the same thing with 3, right? You're looking for all numbers whose absolute value is 3. That is, you're looking for all numbers whose distance from 0 is 3. Well, if you start at 0, you go 1, 2, 3 units to the right, you're at 3. 3, and again, but what about the left, the other direction? 1, 2, you're at -3. So this has 2 solutions, 3 and -3. All right, we're actually at a time. We're actually like right at a time. So let me stop this.